Morning, 8:03 is the time. I'm first warning meteorologist Eric Burris, and this is Coffee Talk. We get together every day, 7 days a week. We chat about what's going on in the world of weather. The overall goal is to try and get you not only up to date on our current weather, but also chat with some people and learn from some people and just kind of broaden your knowledge, especially about weather that impacts all of us. So with that said, let's just start off right now with a beautiful shot in downtown Orlando. Things are absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. We are starting off with mainly clear skies. We are enjoying the sun shining. It is a gorgeous start to the day. In terms of temperatures, we are nice and comfortable still, with readings across Central Florida sitting in the 60s for most of us. I did see one or two lower 70s. I even saw one or two 50s on the map, but still just absolutely gorgeous. First warning, live Doppler radar in Central Florida is rain-free this morning. When we look outside to the forecast today, it's cover-to-cover sunshine. We've got beautiful weather. Morning readings in the 60s, climbing to the 70s, getting into the low and even mid-range of the 80s. It is a very warm day in Central Florida. Absolutely beautiful stuff. But it's going to be one of those days where you're going to be reminded that summer is right around the corner. These last couple of days have been wonderful. But we're building on this theme. More and more heat. We're not to necessarily record values, but our temperatures for sure are getting toward record values, right? Like the forecast for tomorrow continues to be warm. Record is 94. Forecast is 84. Just 1 second here. Troubleshooting with audio with our special guest, whom I'm very excited and certainly hope that we can get taken care of, having some audio issues. So, but we do have set up for today, assuming these audio issues can be taken care of. We've got Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who, of course, puts out the Colorado State University forecast. So if you see me having to do some typing and things, I'm chatting and trying to get... Sorry about that. Just trying to get that lined up. So at any rate, it's beautiful here locally in Central Florida. Obviously, we're not talking about any kind of severe issues or anything here locally. I do want to point out, though, that while we are nice and quiet here locally, other parts of the country are looking at the threat for strong to severe storms today. As a matter of fact, in the nation's midsection, if you've been paying any attention to the overall weather picture these last couple of days, you're aware that there have been... Oh, looks like I've got audio now. We do have audio. All right. So we're going to chat with you here in just a second, Phil. Let me, Dr. Klotzbach, excuse me. Let me get this set up. It's so good to hear you. All right. So real fast, this morning, the lead story on the Today Show, of course, was the severe weather that was moving through Arkansas, Fort Smith, for example, and looking out that direction later today, once again in Texas and right through the heart of Tornado Alley. There is a level 3 risk for strong to severe storms. But with our 7-day forecast looking the way that it is, just take a look at temperatures from the 70s and highs to the mid 80s to the 90s. And while we are not to summertime, while we are not to hurricane season, this 7-day forecast absolutely previews the fact that just days from now, hurricane season begins. 50 days, as a matter of fact, from now. 50 days from now, hurricane season begins, and the long-range forecasts start coming out around this time. And the long-range prognosticator of prognosticators is joining us on Coffee Talk this morning. Dr. Phil Klotzbach, it's great to hear you. It's great to see you. Thank you for agreeing to join us this morning.
Apologies for the audio issues.
Listen, it's as you said, Skype doesn't work well on Macs. I use a Mac as well, so I know exactly how fun that is. For anybody that doesn't know, I mean, to me and to our meteorological community, you and the team at Colorado State University are experts on long-range forecasting. And before we get to what you and your team are calling for this year, would you thrill us and just kind of explain how did you get into this position working under Dr. Gray years ago and kind of now following that path forward? Do me a favor and just explain if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I work at Colorado State University. We've been doing seasonal hurricane predictions for, this is our 39th year. We started all the way back in 1984. I was not a part of that first seasonal forecast in 1984. Then I was in nursery school. I worked with Dr. Bill Gray, who was the founder of the seasonal forecast. In addition to founding the seasonal forecast, Dr. Gray made amazing contributions to tropical cyclone genesis, structure, intensity change, just a giant in the field of tropical meteorology. And I was very fortunate to work under him for over 15 years. He passed away in 2016, but he was very passionate about seasonal predictions. And so, we get a lot of questions saying, why do you issue seasonal forecasts in Colorado? You're not really near anywhere where hurricanes are. And his answer was, because the storm surge can't get you at 5,000 feet.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And it's one of those weather phenomena that you could live in Alaska and still be so interested in studying because they are the most powerful storms on Earth. Going forward, how do you feel your contributions to the world of tropical meteorology would be? Is it kind of in that same envelope, or do you hope to take it kind of in a forward motion?
Yeah, and so I should actually mention I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in Massachusetts, so we didn't have a ton of hurricanes, but we were impacted by both Hurricane Gloria in 1985 and then Hurricane Bob in 1991, which kind of really got me more interested in hurricanes. But certainly as a kid, I was fascinated by pretty much all weather phenomenon. I think that's pretty common amongst meteorologists. So usually there's one kind of event that really gets them interested in hurricanes, and for me it would have been Hurricane Gloria back in 1985. But when it comes to seasonal prediction, I certainly am working on trying to improve the forecast. We use a variety of different techniques to try to get at those, to try to better be able to improve those. We're incorporating more output from various climate models to basically try to improve those forecasts. And then we also do predictions now on a subseasonal timescale. So during the peak months of the hurricane season, we issue 2-week forecasts from August through October. And the reason we do that is because just because you have an above or below normal hurricane season, you can have, in a quiet season, you can have very busy periods, and alternatively, you can have a very busy season that actually has quiet periods. And for example, a good example of that is in 2020, crazy active hurricane season, but in late September, it actually got really, really quiet for about 10, 12 days. Yeah. Then October came around and it got much busier again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's work ahead and just chat about what you and the team are calling for this year. I've got the graphic all set up. Your forecast for this season.
Yeah, that's correct. So we are forecasting the numbers that you show, 19 named storms. So those are storms named by the National Hurricane Center. Those are winds of 39 miles per hour or greater. Of those 19, 9 becoming hurricanes, and of those 9, 4 becoming major category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Those are hurricanes with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. And while they only make up on average about 20-25% of all the storms that form, they do about 80-85% of the damage. And obviously last year, the most notable of those major hurricanes was Hurricane Ida, which obviously brought devastation to Louisiana, and then obviously caused tremendous flooding in the mid-Atlantic states as well.
Absolutely. Now, we dive deeper into your forecast, and I've built this map to kind of illustrate your probability of a storm within 50 miles of each state. We're here in Florida, and once again, you kind of have us as the highest percentage. Some people always love to... Whenever I share your forecast in community organizations, they always say, they always say it's going to be an above average season, to which I say, that's not always the case. They always say Florida is going to be the target. That's not always the case. But looking at this year's forecast, that is the case. What brought you to that conclusion?
Yeah, and so the way that we come up with our probabilities of landfall is we basically calculate historical probabilities of landfall for each state, and then we simply adjust them up or down based on the latest forecast. So when we're forecasting an above normal hurricane season, the probabilities go up. when you're forecasting the below normal season, the probabilities go down. And the reason why Florida generally has the highest probabilities is simply because there's a lot of coastline in the state of Florida. So, and obviously just because, say, a hurricane were to make landfall up in the Florida Panhandle, you might not necessarily have many, if any, impacts down in Miami. Whereas obviously if a hurricane makes landfall, say, in Alabama, the entire coastline of Alabama is going to be significantly impacted, obviously just because Alabama has a very small coastline. The one thing I do want to point out is we do provide probabilities within 50 miles of each state, and that's to kind of smooth out some of the noise. Obviously, for example, a state like Alabama, which has a very small coastline, and obviously hurricane doesn't necessarily need to make landfall in your state to have very significant impacts. Obviously, for example, we can talk about Hurricane Sally in 2020. It made landfall in Alabama, but still brought very significant impacts to the Florida Panhandle.
Right. So that's why you go with the 50 miles. And so I've listed your averages and your 2022 forecast. So for example, as you're calling for an above average season, the average would be 56% chance of a hurricane within 50 miles of the Florida Peninsula. This year you're forecasting 75. And frankly, the numbers for a major hurricane are fairly elevated there as well, 44%.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's basically that's the exact same methodology that we're using is, again, calculating those historical probabilities and then adjusting them up or down based on the forecast. And you can certainly have a very quiet overall season and have one or more very nasty hurricanes. And a great example of that for the state of Florida is 1992. Dr. Gray and the team were issuing seasonal forecasts in 1992. They had a great forecast that year of only one major hurricane. There was only one major hurricane, but it happened to be obviously Hurricane Andrew, brought devastation down in southern Miami-Dade County when it made landfall as a Category 5. But in general, more active seasons do have more landfalling hurricanes, simply just because if there's more storms out there, the odds of one or more of those making landfall and causing damage to go out are elevated. And obviously a great example of that would be 2020.
Certainly. And we always like to use 92 as an example because Floridians have become so accustomed to these very, very active seasons. And when you think to the first named storm being in August, becoming a tropical cyclone and then a hurricane and then a major hurricane very, very quickly, and then doing that kind of damage, it's just changed the way that buildings are built. I mean, here in Florida for that matter. I do want to take a moment, open up questioning to all of our viewers, and I'll just kind of I'll filter through that, of course, to make sure that we've got a really good group of people here, including several meteorologists that are working in other fields as well. So I'm kind of curious to get those questions. I did see a few people asking about El Nino and La Nina. Would you just kind of elaborate a little bit on how that plays into your methodology?
Yeah, so that's one of the prime things that we use to forecast Atlantic hurricane seasons. And it goes all the way back to Dr. Gray in the early 1980s when he started issuing these forecasts. He was an empiricist, so he would basically look and find relationships, and then he would use those historical relationships to then basically issue forecasts. And so in the early 1980s, he was teaching tropical meteorology, and he noticed, hey, when we have El Nino, which is warmer than normal water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, we tend to get fewer hurricanes in the Atlantic. And so basically you found the statistical relationship and then tried to understand the physics of why something going on in the tropical Pacific Ocean would impact hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. And he found it was basically through alterations in what's known as vertical wind shear, which is the change in wind direction and speed with height in the atmosphere. And yeah, that's a great graphic basically highlighting how when you have an El Nino, it tends to shift where the thunderstorms form in the tropical Pacific, moves them east. And so at upper levels, when you have a lot of thunderstorms, you get strong upper level westerly winds high up in the atmosphere. And that basically at low levels, so winds near the surface blow out of the east, you have very strong winds at upper levels, so 20, 30,000 feet blowing out of the west, shears apart, tears apart, tilts the hurricane circulation. So El Nino is good for people in hurricanes' path, bad for the hurricanes. This year, unfortunately, we think the odds of an El Nino are very low. NOAA will actually be updating their outlook, but as of their last outlook, which was about a month ago, they said only a 10% chance of El Nino for August through October. So we think since El Nino is unlikely to be there, we're likely to have a much more conducive upper level wind patterns that are likely to lead to an above average hurricane season this year.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So a lot of people are asking just various questions. The way houses are going up so quickly around here, Carolyn is asking, and Carolyn is a meteorologist. So Carolyn is asking, the way that houses are going up so quickly around here, I'm afraid some builders are cutting corners and some of those houses won't hold up well. I think that plays into your whole purpose of trying to just prepare people days and weeks and months ahead of time, right?
Well, that's correct. And I should mention with the seasonal forecast, these are an informational tool. People are curious. They want to know how busy the Atlantic hurricane season is going to be, but we can't say months in advance when or where a storm is going to strike. So while in general, more active seasons do have more landfalls, we always emphasize it only takes one. And I think pretty much all the broadcast meteorologists, all the emergency managers always emphasize that, it only takes that one storm to make it an active season for you. So, while there is scientific interest and there's scientific reasons for doing these predictions, it's an informational tool, not a preparedness tool. But yeah, when it comes to, buildings and building codes, Florida generally has pretty strict building codes. But one of the keys is not only that they have building codes, that those building codes actually be enforced, which, is an important thing as well. But in general, Florida's building codes are quite robust compared with several other coastal states. So hopefully when the next storm comes through, that those buildings will be able to hold up to the damage. Kind of the thing that we always emphasize is that, or that the emergency management community also emphasizes, that the idea is that you run from the water. If there's a storm coming in and there's storm surge, you really got to get out of that storm surge zone. Because even if you have a well-built house, if it's 4 feet above sea level and you have 7 feet of storm surge, you certainly don't want to be there. But if you have a well-built house and it's, you have winds coming in, say gusts to 100 miles an hour, and your house is built to withstand that, then you shouldn't, you can take some preventative measures, but don't necessarily need to evacuate.
Certainly. Yeah. And we say that all the time. All right. So somebody's asking about ACE. Chris Pierce is asking, any thought on predicting ACE? And I already know, but I'd love for you to just elaborate on that.
Yeah, so ACE is one of my favorite metrics. So ACE stands for Accumulated Cyclone Energy, and it's kind of a geeky metric, but it accounts for storm frequency, intensity, and duration. So for example, a storm, last year we had a storm called Hurricane Sam that most people probably haven't heard of, but it was a major hurricane for over a week. So it was a very long-lived, intense hurricane, generated a tremendous amount of ACE. Whereas a very short, weak storm generates very little ACE. So that index kind of gets an overall indication of how much basically energy a hurricane season generates. So a recent example of a storm that people probably are familiar with is Hurricane Irma in 2017. Very long-lived major hurricane, reached Category 5 status for several days. That storm generated more ACE than several hurricane seasons. It generated almost enough ACE by itself to meet the definition of an average season. So we actually, with our seasonal forecasts, the primary metric that we target for our forecast is actually that ACE metric. And then what we do is we then say, okay, for example, this case, our ACE was 160 is what the models gave us. And then we say, okay, when you have that ACE value, how does that then break down in terms of the number of storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes? And I'm very impressed how quickly you were able to pull up the Hurricane Irma track. That was
I'm doing my best.
Impressive, man.
So that's actually really interesting. I never really thought about it. So you basically start off your forecasting off of ACE, and then you elaborate into your number kind of nomenclature from there.
Yeah, that's correct. And so one thing you might notice with the forecast lately is, so used to be kind of the rule of thumb was hurricane. So if the number of storms, hurricanes on average is about half, or maybe slightly even more than half. Whereas now, if you look at our numbers in general, we forecast named storms to be or basically you have more than twice as many named storms as you have hurricanes. And that's because they're actually naming more storms than we used to. Yep. And these are generally very weak, very short-lived storms. We had a lot of those in 2021, also in 2020. And they are storms. These are real storms. They're not naming stuff that isn't a storm, but we just have better technology, better satellites that we can now observe these kind of weak storms than we used to. So, overall, when you see necessarily, going into the Greek or formerly when they had the Greek alphabet, going into the Greek alphabet or going to the end of the naming list, I recommend that you look at other indices as well, things like hurricanes and major hurricanes, because we are naming more of these weak storms. And for example, last year we had 21 storms, but of those 21, only 7 became hurricanes. Overall, it was a little bit above normal season, but given how many storms we had historically, had we had 21 storms, we'd have had a lot more hurricanes. But again, we're just naming more weak, short-lived storms than we used to.
That's fascinating. That's so fascinating. Getting a clue into how you and your team put together the forecast. So with that said, then, if you don't mind, share with everybody a little more about how you work through your process? When do you start? Is it you and a pen and paper and you're like, just don't talk to me for 6 months? How does that work?
Yeah, and so the seasonal forecast, we'll start with the April one because that's the one we just put out last week. So with the April forecast, year round, I'm always looking at things, and honestly, even by like November of last year, start kind of thinking ahead to what might happen in 2022. So we always monitoring these large scale conditions, and then usually starting about early to mid March is when they start kind of assembling the data that we need to issue these forecasts. That involves kind of monitoring, water temperatures around the world, looking at some pressure patterns. And then we also, so our final forecast is a variety of different techniques. We have a statistical model, which is kind of similar to what Dr. Gray would have used in the early 1980s, where we basically select regions that worked well at forecasting historical hurricane activity. And so we base that on about 40 years of historical weather and climate data. We also have hurricane data. The Atlantic Hurricane Database goes all the way back to 1851. But it's obviously, we observe hurricanes a lot differently now than we did in 1851. Oh, yeah. But 1950 for an index such as ACE, which again is our primary metric, it's not too bad. But with statistical modeling, we go back to the early 1980s because that's when we start getting really high resolution sea surface temperature data, which is really helpful for our seasonal forecasts. We also now are doing stuff that Dr. Gray couldn't have done in the early 1980s because climate models were in their infancy and really weren't very good, is we can actually use climate models to forecast what the environment is going to look like during the hurricane season. And now we don't necessarily, a model's not going to be able to say, June 23rd, the winds are going to have this particular. Right. That we can't do, but if you look at like a monthly average or a 3-month average, the models do a reasonably good job. So we have basically built kind of what's known as a hybrid model, where you use a climate model to forecast what the environment is going to look like, and then assuming that model is correct, then saying, okay, if that works out, then how would that relate to hurricane season? And these climate models have anywhere between like 25 and 40 years of historical data that they will build their model off of, because obviously they want to verify that their model actually works. So we kind of get a track record of how well these models should do at forecasting in real time. And then one last technique we use is actually what's known as an analog technique, whereby we go back into the past and we look for years into the past that had conditions most similar to what we currently see and what we expect to see for the peak of the season. And now if you ask myself and you ask 10 other meteorologists, we probably would have a couple of years that would overlap, but then we may have some different years. And the key with analogs is that's kind of overall what we think the overall environment is going to look like. But just because, for example, honestly, our best analog for this year at this point is actually last year, which is quite unusual. Normally last year doesn't look a lot like the current year. Mm-hmm. But in this 2021, there's a good analog, but we're not saying we're necessarily expecting to see another Hurricane Ida in 2021. Just overall, the environment looks fairly similar.
Right, absolutely. That's fascinating. One last question from a viewer, and then I'll have one last one to wrap it up and let you get on with your day because it's coffee and breakfast and all that fun stuff. Tim asks, do you have historical accuracy data for your storm forecasts?
Yes, and so we have a variety of different basically we have a variety of different accuracy metrics. So you can look at the basically the accuracy that the models should have based on the historical data that we used to develop them. And then we also have, since we've been doing this for 39 years, we have basically our historical track record. So on our website, we actually have, a plot year by year of here's how many hurricanes we forecast, here's how many were observed. And so on average, here's a perfect plot. This is showing the forecast of our statistical model going back to 1982. And so the red line in this plot is the what our model says we should have had for accumulated cyclone energy, and the blue is the observed values. And so you can see in general, it's not a perfect match, but we can get about 40% of the variability in April, and then the skill improves as we do update our forecast in June, July, and August. And so, that's kind of an ACE geeky metric. If you want to know kind of an easier way to validate it, is that on average, our hurricane activity, our seasonal forecast for hurricanes is basically the error is about plus or minus 2. So for example, in this case, we're forecasting 9. The error bar is 7 to 11. And I should mention that while, you showed, here's some plots of probably, we have basically calculated kind of the expected range of the forecast given the historical track record error of the models. So for example, this is a plot showing probability that you would exceed a specific number of hurricanes in a particular year, both historically and then for 2022. And since we're forecasting an above normal season, the probability of exceeding, say 11 hurricanes is like, I think 20-ish% or something like that. So in the forecast itself, we actually have error bars similar to what you would see with NOAA's seasonal forecast. So, say they were forecasting 9 hurricanes, they would say, the range is 7 to 11. And we just kind of want to give one number that gives our best estimate, but there certainly is uncertainty associated with those.
It's not like you're forecasting months and months ahead of time. All right, so you are actually in Orlando, and I believe you and I are going to chat in person so that I can get it on a high-resolution tape later, which, yay, thank you for being amazing. I owe you some Starbucks and or a lunch. But tell everybody why you're in Orlando, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so this is the National Hurricane Conference. So, it's actually just registered, and at the conference they had 2,100 attendees. So it's fantastic. There's a lot of great information exchange between meteorologists, emergency managers. There's people from the private sector, kind of trying to get ideas, especially with COVID and doing everything virtually. And even last year they were able to hold a conference, but the attendance was lower. Trying to get everybody together. Obviously, the last 2 years have been extremely busy. Discuss lessons learned, best practices, how we can improve, because whether this season ends up being above normal or quiet, there's probably going to be impact somewhere with some storm. And so it's really important to, kind of exchange ideas and better be able to prepare for the next hurricane.
Very good. Dr. Klotzbach, thank you so very much for joining us. I hope that I can borrow you every year and chat with you on our coffee talk and interview you as well at the conference. Have a great day. I will chat with you a little bit later. Thank you, sir.
Sounds good. Thank you. Apologies again for the audio.
We're all human, and not everything is perfect. Go have breakfast. Thank you, buddy. All right, everybody. Dr. Klotzbach from Colorado State University. Let me just tell you, just a fantastic, fantastic person. When I reached out to him trying to organize a brief chat on Coffee Talk, he was so willing to come on and chat. And I know that we got into the weeds just a little bit there, but, for goodness sake, if you're here, you're probably a little bit of a weather nerd. So I am so grateful to have him, and hopefully we could have him on annually to chat about his hurricane forecast. That said, here's our 7-day forecast. I know we got into the tropics just a little bit, but today is kind of the, a big day for tropical weather. I'm going down to the National Hurricane Conference. I'm chatting with Dr. Klotzbach. We're going to get more sound with him. We'll have that on our hurricane and storm survival. What is it? It's the hurricane special that airs. So we'll have that. I'm going to interview several other people from the National Hurricane Center. But I'm just so grateful that now when you hear Colorado State University, when you hear the name Phil Klotzbach and his team, that's the guy. We got to chat with him. So at any rate, nothing to track in the tropics for now, but it is right around the corner after all. By the way, just while we're chatting, just so that everybody's on the same page, in terms of the long-range forecasting, I did put together this showing, using the LRC, showing that in the month of May, the 16th-ish and the 17th-ish, mid-May, would be that first signal of the November 6th storm system. So we are going to do these looking ahead to hurricane season this year, okay? All right, listen, I will see you guys and gals at 3:30-ish for the afternoon coffee talk. Dr. Klotzbach will be presenting here in Central Florida. So lots of fun stuff happening. But at any rate, listen, be the sunshine in someone else's day. I will see you guys and gals later, and we will chat